G'day there, it's Dave here, Dave Mells, with another exciting problem. And I'm going to talk to you about resultant forces. A few of my friends who've listened to these privately have asked me about resultant forces. Resultant forces obviously produce an acceleration in your position, and obviously the longer you can apply them, the bigger change in momentum you can do in a position. And obviously your development is from T1 to T2. Okay, so that's an easy, and multiplied by the resultant forces. Okay, and so that's where the forces are all combining, and just briefly, force obviously is related to your position's momentum. Okay, force is a change of momentum over a change of tempo. Like, how long is it going to take you to get your piece there, and how does that change the momentum, the combination of forces? So obviously a change of momentum is a change in your linear momentum. In development sense, it's from T1 to T2, and like from when the opening starts to when the opening finishes. Start tempo to finish tempo, and you have your initial velocity and your final velocity, V1 and V2. So that can occur in attack, a combination, and so on. And now, in a mating attack or a winning attack, is in the case for the problem number 16. So why talk about physics? Well, physics explains complex systems, and I honestly believe this is a significant breakthrough in the theory. It's not classical. It's not hypermodern. It's not technician in the modern age that we have now. It's in the modern game, it's a lot of study of your opponent's latest moves and then tailoring your attack to how they play, and it's very much a sniper way of playing. It's highly skilled. Wind speed, pressure, air temperature, the whole thing factors in on a sniper, and they target you on you and take you out. So I honestly believe this physics view is going to explain a lot of things from AlphaZero's perspective. It's going to explain chess in a new way, and these new chess physicists are going to come from this, I predict, are going to be at an even higher level. They're going to, the technical standard still has to be there, but underpinning that is a more richer understanding of the game, which is why AlphaZero has really just sort of highlighted our understanding of the game is limited, and I've worked on this for over 20 years, so I honestly believe the concepts are shared, and in this case what we have is a situation where which is opposite to problem number 15. We see that black has actually penetrated into the end zone with the rook, and the queen is well positioned and is controlling that long diagonal, so to speak. And so how can we actually look at this position? How can we get our teeth into it? Well, the first thing to realize is there's actually the combination of the rook and the queen on that loose, semi-loose rook at f8. What I mean by semi-loose, it's only defended once, and also, so that's definitely a minor cog there. And also the king is a terrible defender, as we know, and so he's not really doing a good job there. He's sort of like tied into that point of application. So that tells us the f-pawn is pinned. The f-pawn can't move, or you will come crashing through. And also, even though black has a piece up, as in the bishop's not doing anything. The bishop's not... It has no activity. It's defending the f-pawn, but that's it. And the thing is, while it's sort of holding, the light squares, so is white's light squared pawn structure, and controlling e6, and so that bishop is not really doing anything. It's like a tall pawn. So we see the king is quite exposed. We see the king is tied to the rook. We see the f-pawn is pinned. And so now we want to talk about acceleration, a change of velocity. So obviously, velocity is speed plus direction. Tempo. So how can we gain tempo? How can we gain speed here? Obviously, the most forcing way to gain tempo, to apply the most force, is to check the king. So no matter how ridiculous it appears, you got to check all the checks. So that rook on h4 can check the king at g4. And as we discussed, that f pawn is pinned. It's pinned to the f file because the king is a terrible defender, and the white's position has had duration of pieces against that point of that rigid, that point of application. Now, the rook is able to check here, and so there's a couple of ideas that black has. Idea number one: block with the queen, trade the queen for the rook, and with good play, it's crushing for white. Okay, so particularly with those connected pass pawns, the C and D pawns. So what can the king do? The king is tied to the rook. So if the king moves to h7 or moves to h8, then the rook just drops with queen takes rook. So the king has to go to f7. Now, white can't play rook takes the f pawn because the bishop is doing something. But what we actually see here is that the queen is now able to continue the dance, continue the game, and check the king. So the king is checked at f7. So where can the king go? If the king goes to f6, the queen goes to g7, checkmate. The king has nowhere to move, and the queen on g7 is protected by the rook, which is attacked by a pawn, which seems ridiculous. So we know f6 is a danger, it's a hot zone. Alright, we see that the resultant forces, the combination on that square at g7 with the rook on g4, so the queen is beautifully expressing these resultant forces in the position, which means acceleration. And obviously, if development is the fast acting force, momentum is it's the ongoing force. It's the force that just can't be stopped. Okay, and like a train, it's the freight train. It goes right through. Obviously, resultant forces are forces combining and acting on a rigid piece or square, and in this case, that rigid square at g7 is now a death square if the king goes to f6. So the king can flee to e8. The king has returned home, and at this point now, what can white do? Well, white can take the bishop and check the king. That's that's always a good thing. Then the queen can lift again and check, and the king can go back. But what can white do to threaten mate? Well, the queen's at c7, the king's at e8. The rook can come crashing through to g7, threatening the mate on the dark squares at e7. The attack just plays itself. Obviously, the rook to f7 doesn't really work. You can actually capture that rook with the the rook or the queen and still be crushing. So what's actually happening here is, if you do bring the rook down, one of the best moves of black is actually just play queen takes rook, and then once again you drop the queen for the rook. So it's going to be mate, or you're going to trade the queen for the rook in this position. So let's just sort of talk about that. Let's sort of understand it from the theory point of view, and let's sort of break it down. What it comes down to is that the pieces were able to combine their energies together in the sense of that resulting forces acting on rigid pieces and also on rigid squares. And you're going to find all the time positions are going to look quite good for the opponent, but actually there's inherent weaknesses, and particularly around the king in this sense. The rook is suddenly able to become a monster at g4, and it's because we realize we actually realize in this position that the f pawn is pinned. There's actually the forces are combining together on a rigid piece and a rigid square, I should say. And in this case, it's either f8 and g7. The dark squares are very, very weak, and so also one of the differences is one is faster than the other. All right, because it's white's turn to move, it's able to accelerate with checks and threats of mate, and force the loss of material. It's what's actually happened in modern chess is path dependence. And what I mean by path dependence is they're so developed on their openings, their themes, and studying their opponents that during the development phase, they're dogmatic. They don't re-examine their thinking, and they are very set in their ways, and they use their same tricks over and over again, and the same positions that they like. And so another thing about torque and obviously resultant forces, the knights are able to apply some torque to a position, not in this position, but often to help make resultant forces quite devastating. And whereas balanced forces, net forces, when you look at it, it's all about tension. But tension and torque, it all leads to momentum. Okay, and both torque is to do with resultant forces, whereas balanced forces to do with tension. And in both sense, it's a question of momentum and it's a question of counting. And if you think about this, you think about the truth of the position. The king, misalignments. Think about loose pieces, semi-loose pieces, barrages and batteries. You're going to solve those complex positions. And solving complex positions is what the development momentum theory is all about. Extremely complex positions, resolving it. And so obviously that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope I was able to talk to you about these positions, talk to you about rigid pieces and squares, points of application. Obviously, different points of application have different effects on the game, and obviously how pieces can get bound to their points of application. In this case, it was the king bound to the rook, and in this case, it's the f pawn was sort of bound to the f file, and and the fact is that duration on target, the queen and the rook hitting on that square, that rigid square, the square in f8 doesn't change the whole game. The fact that you're combining on that with resultant forces on that square has actually been able to produce this situation, this devastating situation. And so you don't just go pawn grabbing with rook takes h6. You go after the king with the most forcing line. And before you make this move in a tournament, you should be able to visualize it. You should be able to calculate it. And there's these turning points, these moments, and where you just realize that bound pieces, right? The king is bound to his point of application, all right, and which is the rook. And the f pawn is bound to the f file. Because of that, you're able to get a third piece, the rule of three. You're able to get the rook involved and behind enemy lines, and that's just absolutely devastating. Bishop doesn't really do anything, and the queen doesn't do anything except sacrifice herself to prevent the mate, which is very sad. All right. Take care, everyone. Put your questions down below. If you tell me if you like it, if you don't like it, if you understand it, if you don't understand it, what you think of the content, and are you actually starting to think about the theory during your game? Tell me about how you've applied it and in your game. That'd be great. subscribe, press the doobie doos and all that good stuff down below. Alright, bye!